All right, this should look familiar. Uh, this is the map that this series has just concluded on, but we are not in combat mission. We are in map.army. Um, so I wanted to talk through sort of my thought process through the game, as well as how I thought things went, what I thought could have been done differently, and how things might have gone differently. So first, when looking at this map, it's pretty evident that it's kind of designed around uh, two objectives for each side, and then you can kind of fight over it somewhere in the middle. So I was sort of interested in disrupting that to an extent. Um, and Additionally, with my opponent starting back here and the two objectives there, and then the hill in the middle, very broadly speaking, there's kind of three possible avenues of approach for him in very broad sense, right? He can go on the left, he can go on the right, go in the middle. This is not, cutting edge tactical analysis. This is pretty straightforward. Um, but with this in mind, I wanted to come up with a plan that would account for that and also leverage the advantages of the force that I had put together. Um, so, as you know by this point, my force was, broadly speaking, two platoons of tanks with descent riders, assault infantry, um, a engineer platoon, a recon platoon, and just some supporting assets and mortars for fires. Um, So this is a force that is very fast. Everything has wheels or tracks. It's a force that has a lot of firepower and protected firepower, but it's also very small. Uh, you know, I don't necessarily have with this force the ability to put a ton of mass in one position, particularly with having to cover the rest of the area. So really wanted to make sure that I was on the offensive and that I was fighting on my turns. Um, So I identified from this that if I wanted to really, make a move for an objective early, grain would be the best one because, just coming through this open field kind of sucks. I can really get up close here, have the fight on my terms. Um, and I could also, with the terrain denial fires, potentially prevent him from accessing it here. And then I felt that this was relatively defensible just because of all the open ground here. So that was sort of the plan. So this, very broadly speaking, was the plan that I employed from the beginning. Um, so from left to right, we have the recon platoon. Really, it's a platoon minus. They have a little car with them that does end up going up a little further. I don't have that represented here. Um, so they're screening the left flank. We have the engineers and one of the tank and tank rider platoons in the center, and we have the other tank platoon and tank riders on the top right, supported by the anti-aircraft gun. We also have two additional tanks back in supporting positions and the forward observer. So I was pretty confident that I would get to this objective and this objective, no matter what his forces were, by the time at least that far before we were before he was occupying these positions. And I was hoping to be able to get up to this position before he was really able to fully occupy it. So that was the motivation behind um, the first turn artillery. Unfortunately, it came in a little early. We'll talk about that in a second. Um, and then the plan here is just to assault with this platoon and this anti-aircraft gun. These guys down here are occupying. That's what the symbol means. The objective orange here in the middle, and then they are blocking. I'm sort of misappropriating the blocking symbols here, but they are going to be blocking enemies coming down through the hill or enemies coming from objective red, and then the recon platoon here preventing a bold flank. So generally speaking, I think that the plan and the assignments were generally good. I thought that there were some errors in the execution. Starting with the terrain denial fires, these were not effective. They came in immediately. They came in kind of heavy, and I called it off early for fear of burning through too much ammo. And my opponent did confirm that he never saw this at all. So this had no effect. Um, uh, Appropriate implementation probably would have been a slower fire rate, still with a turn one impact, just because it would, even going to take him a couple turns in here. You don't want it landing turn 5 while he's already occupying that. For it to be most effective, it needs to be already landing as he's coming up the hill. Um, the other option would have been to just fully commit the mortar to doing that, but that obviously, you know, would have some risks. That said, we didn't really end up using the mortar elsewhere, so that would have been okay. I think this assault in general kind of needed a finer point. I think we tried to cover a lot of ground with a relatively small amount of troops, and I think making entrance into the town from one point and then kind of clearing through consistently would have gone better. There was very little concentration of mass over here, um, and while we did come out on top of everything, obviously, uh, I don't think that's necessarily because this assault was massively planned. I think it was a little bit aimless, actually. I think really that's just because we had a favorable matchup of equipment. Um, Further, there wasn't really too much of a plan following this. I was kind of planning on occupying this, holding this, and then sort of seeing what state everything was in, assuming he would probably try to counterattack or come across here, that which would have been much preferable. I think this would have been a terrible move for him. Um, but there was not really a great follow-up plan. And further, just because of the small size of my force, this is basically a platoon of infantry, a platoon of tanks, and an anti-aircraft gun. Relatively small force for this size of fight. Um, it would have been good to create some sort of problem for him down here to prevent him from, fully committing any reserves to this area, or even shifting forces from Objective Red or from the middle over to here to defend. So tying those forces up in some way would have been probably more effective. Um, as for my opponent, I think, really the main reason that this went the way it did, is because of his force selection. So he surrendered ultimately because his force did not really have the capability to deal with tanks, and I had a lot of tanks. And we killed his tank destroyer in the opening moments of the fight for this objective, and we killed the other tank that came over to counterattack. And then after that, there's no indigenous anti-tank weaponry in the platoons that he had, or the infantry or anything. He didn't have any AT guns. Um, he did have a plane, an IL-2, which in this game you don't really have control over. Did not make an appearance. We heard it, I think, around turn 10 or something, but it never really showed up. Um, and even had it shown up, we did have the anti-aircraft gun, which potentially would have been a problem for that. Um, he also had some issues with fires. He had a mortar team, but they did not have a radio, and he struggled to get them into a position where they could both communicate verbally with a forward observer who would be able to see us, and also not expose themselves to fire. And they actually, while walking this way, were picked off by a tank from over here, I believe. Um, so by the end of the game, things kind of looked a little bit more like this. Um, he had about a company on Objective Red, single squad over here, basically doing the same thing as these guys, I think being a screening force. He had a little platoon plus in this woods, and he had a platoon or so between this first sort of copse of buildings there, his deployment zone, and this road. He also had approximately a platoon's worth of men of just miscellaneous, half broken squads and stuff up in the objective green that probably would not have held up to clearance. Um, so, from this position, I think he was relatively well contained from trying to pull a flank this way. And as his guys trying to come through this tree line found, he wasn't really able to effectively make it into here. And really, his only concentration of forces outside of this, Objective Red was very well fortified. If were it not for his inability to deal with tanks, I think this would have been really, really hard to capture. And that said, if he were to muster enough troops from there to mount a counterattack, he would have left this relatively undefended. So I think at this point, even if he were to get some sort of anti-tank capability injected, he would have a hard time, um, improving his position. But that said, again, were he to have some sort of anti-tank capability, I think it would have been relatively challenging to improve our position from here and to attack this town. So one thing I wanted to talk about is, given my initial plan, which I will pull up again, what would have been sort of the most dangerous course of action for him to mount? Um, well, obviously one would be that he probably would not have sunk any points into planes and instead put those into tank or anti-tank capability. Um, I think, this screen would have given me hopefully enough warning to sort of reposture forces on Objective Orange in the south, but a flank through this way and then through the cover of these buildings certainly would have been a better approach than coming straight across this field. Um, and I think maybe pairing that with forces coming from the hill would have been potentially effective. The other thing that could have been pretty damaging would be a stiffer anti-tank defense in Objective Green. Um, I think, due to the unfocused nature of this attack, if the forces in Objective Green had had the ability to deal with tanks, that would have been pretty effective because, we ended up really relying on the tanks in close proximity to deal with infantry and buildings. Um, so that would have been potentially pretty tricky. I don't think that the plane or going further into the plane kind of angle would have been particularly effective. I think even had I not had the anti-aircraft capability, he would have struggled to do too much damage with it, just because of all the buildings and the trees and the tanks being amongst those as opposed to out in the open. Um, so that was that. I mean, we already talked about how that wasn't a particularly effective option, but I don't think that is a potential dangerous contingency. Another one I think that could have been tricky is if he had just forsaken Objective Green off the bat and really pushed through this way and come out of this hill in force while we were still kind of occupying Objective Orange. I don't know if the movement speed kind of angle on that tracks. I think just the open ground here and the trees and hill here would have made that tough to do, but it would have been rough. I think had this attack met stiffer resistance initially, it would have been tough for us to recover just due to the small nature of our forces, particularly, again, if he had had more robust anti-tank capability. So that's about it. Again, this is the ending state. I think as far as, lessons learned, the big thing would be to the timing of the terrain denial fires, the coordination of that first assault, which really, kind of, I mean, we dealt with anti-tank capability there, but would have really struggled had there been stiffer resistance. In general, I think having a longer term plan after the first objective went down, even though the game didn't get to that point, would have been beneficial, and finding some way to cause a problem for him during that assault. Lastly, I just want to talk about the idea of mass. I think that, particularly in World War II games, concentration of mass geographically is important. I think this force that I built maybe bears a little bit more resemblance to a modern title force, and I kind of wanted to do that on purpose, and I also kind of wanted to try to hit this as quickly as possible to mitigate, the potential inability to really concentrate mass and firepower with the force that I had and the map that we had and the scenario and everything. So I think again the actual plan of things I think was interesting and well conceived, but the execution can be tightened up. All right, I might append in a little bit of thoughts from his perspective if he has anything to add, but otherwise that's it.